Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Self-Scheduling Success, Creating the Framework. I am Terry Messier, Client Marketing Manager here at Medfusion. We are happy to have you join us today to hear from industry expert Elizabeth Woodcock. Sean Cheriker, Medfusion's Marketing Director, will also join us briefly to speak on how Medfusion's patient self-scheduling can help your practice. Before Elizabeth begins, I have a few housekeeping items. Should you have any questions throughout the presentation, please use the chat box to type them in. We will take time at the end of the presentation to have Elizabeth or Sean answer your questions. The presentation is being recorded and you will receive a link to it early next week. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Woodcock. She has a breadth of experience in the patient engagement field to share with you. She is not only an accomplished presenter, but also a successful business owner and author. Take it away, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Terry. It's certainly a pleasure to be here today. Thank you to Medfusion for sponsoring our webinar. And thanks to all of y'all who are joining us on what we know is a busy day, taking the time out to hear more about self-scheduling success, creating the framework. And I think we're going to give you a great return on investment for your time because this is an exciting, relatively new initiative for practices, but one that I think 10 years from now, we'll all look back and wonder why we didn't do it earlier. Let's start off with our case for change, and then we'll talk about that traditional PDSA cycle, starting up by planning for self-scheduling. And then, well, you will have some refinements. I want to introduce at least one or two of those. And of course, I'm sure you'll have more in your practice, but let's get you started on that. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, let's talk about ROI. That is return on investment. Because we want to make sure, like any practice management initiative you're going to do within your medical practice, that this is a great one, giving you a positive return both financially as well as from a patient service perspective. Now, we've all heard about self-scheduling, but we do need a framework for making sure that we can initiate it successfully. Because, of course, we know this great mantra, a goal without a plan is simply a wish. So let's talk about why this would be a really good initiative today, the case for change. And so our case for change are certainly that our patients' expectations are changing. Look at this. In just a few short years, from 2016 to 2019, we saw the expectations for booking, changing, and canceling appointments online going from 58 to 68%. And those numbers are even going further up and up, even as we speak. Of course, much of this happens to be a generational issue. We do know that our Gen Xers and our millennials, as well as our Gen Zers, of course, are all ready to go when it comes to booking, changing, or canceling appointments online. And yet, what's interesting is that you may say, wow, Elizabeth, well, we haven't heard that yet, or it's just kind of bubbling up from our patient population. Well, that's not a surprise because the expectations are changing in the minority of our patients. The majority of our patients are those patients, those persons who are 45 years in age and older. Maybe they're not crying for change, but believe you me, we're going to be seeing that our patients will, of course, flip soon, and we'll see more of those Gen Zers, millennials, and Gen Xers be our patient base. And so now's the time to get on board with their expectations. So in addition to those expectations changing, we do know that self-scheduling really can differentiate your practice in the market today. But that's today. It may not be tomorrow. Gartner, who is a leading market research firm, estimates that our webinar today will be something that's relatively stale just a few years down the road, because by 2021, a majority, 70% of practices, they estimate, will be offering self-scheduling options. So if we don't do it today, it is likely something that we'll be headed to tomorrow. Because our patients do want a digital front door. Our patients want to be able to schedule appointments not just from 8 to 5 or 8:30 to noon and 1:15 to 4:30. And then, oh my gosh, because certainly we don't answer the phones outside of those hours. Oh, and goodness gracious, certainly not on Friday afternoons. But when you think about this, our sort of abnormal business hours, which is the only time we answer the phones in some medical practices, that does not marry with our patients, our customers' expectations. And you know what? It's interesting to think about this, but if there were some sort of CPT code we could bill for not answering the phone, maybe that would be a good idea. But the reality is that our appointment schedule is our business development platform. It is our sales director. Our appointment schedulers, that they're not appointment schedulers, they're vice presidents of business development. And so we actually want to make sure that our patients can reach our appointments anytime, day or night, regardless of how they are able to reach us, whether it's by regular phone or by cell phone. So this digital front door, I think, and we could talk more and more about this case for change, but if you're not convinced, just Google appointment scheduling online or self-scheduling for practices, and you'll see a bevy more of information about changing patients' expectations. But what I want to convince you about actually is your perspective as a practice executive. Just one appointment slot that doesn't go down that business development or sales train, it gets left empty. It gets left empty can indeed be an opportunity cost of a whopping $150. If I have a cancellation for a slot yesterday or the day before and I can't refill it, $150 goes down the drain. Even if I could just prevent or rebook an open slot once a day, what we're talking about is $750 a week, and yes, indeed, that's nearly $40,000 a year. And unlike other revenue opportunities, because we already have the rent paid, we already have the medical assistant and the nurse in place, we've already paid for our management information system, our EHR. This is pure profit. So, wow, when you think about that win-win, thinking about our patients' expectations changing, really this being a business differentiator today, but one that our patients are going to really expect from us in just a few short years. And then this financial opportunity, I think it's truly a compelling case for change. Look at all of the chances we have to have that slot dissipate into an empty one. If you look over on that yellow line, that yellow bar, we start off with 1,250 appointments scheduled, and this is actually real data. And what's interesting is between our providers bumping our patients or our patients canceling slots, you can see quickly that those 1,250 scheduled appointments go down to simply 665 arrived encounters. We need every chance we can get to refill those open slots. And folks, this isn't a good solution. Anybody ever seen this type of scenario? Many of us indeed have. This is actually a shot of an appointment scheduler. And how can we do this? I couldn't do this work. You need a PhD in scheduling in order to actually schedule an appointment. So we have a productivity being constrained because slots go unfilled, and our search function simply becomes dysfunctional altogether. We truly need a framework for success for our self-scheduling platform to indeed be successful. So where do we start? I think we take the very basic platform, but a compelling one with an incredible value proposition of the PDSA. That is the Plan, Do, Study, Act. Those of you who are involved with any performance improvement initiative, particularly those with a Lean Six Sigma bent, you've seen this PDSA cycle before. Planning means to define the objective, the questions and the predictions to establish to operational definitions like what is an appointment slot? What are we going to offer online? And let's determine what we are trying to accomplish. Is this something that, for example, we'll be doing for established patients only or new patients? Again, plan, plan, plan. So we want to sit down with our team and engage with our providers as well as our staff. And this might get you started, some questions that you could ask to your team. We are thinking about offering patient self-scheduling. What does that mean to you? Even the term itself, self-scheduling, might actually have different connotations depending on the staff member or provider with whom you're speaking. What aspects of self-scheduling would be appealing to our patients? In what ways could self-scheduling benefit our patients? And in what ways could it benefit our practice? What do you see as the drawbacks of self-scheduling? And what suggestions do you have as we consider the idea of self-scheduling for our practice? So what we're doing very importantly is we're engaging our team, our staff, and our providers to make absolutely sure that as we go through the planning stages that they have a voice. And of course, we know why we do this. We're making sure that our team is engaged from the very get-go because they're going to be the ones who our patients are going to say, hey, I've heard you started offering this self-scheduling thing. What is that all about? We as practice executives can't be everywhere and every place. So we want to make sure that we don't just make this plan in an ivory tower, but we really engage our entire team. And perhaps even importantly, don't just ask individuals, but take the opportunity to get the team together. To get the team together so we can begin to talk about this as a staff and providers all amongst each other at the same time. It's a great opportunity to get a bunch of colorful Sharpie magic markers and some sticky notes and to ask those same questions, but to actually ask them together so there can be a really rich dialogue amongst one another. And once you really kind of tease through those objectives, making sure that you're talking about definitions of appointment slots, and what are we trying to accomplish? Are we just going to move all of our appointments to self-scheduling or simply a portion of them? Let's run a test. Let's make sure with a very simple appointment type, like if we, for example, do screening mammograms in our practice, that's quite often a test that I see practices run with, or goodness gracious, it's a great time this fall to kind of run into flu shots. What about annual physicals? So maybe a simple appointment type that you can test with. Of course, making sure that you have your own employees act as patients and go ahead and quote unquote self-schedule, and maybe ask a few other patients to test that platform for you before you actually distribute it to the masses. So let's engage a patient for feedback about the process. Or a great idea is to present this concept or to present it in test mode to your patient family advisory council. If you don't already have a PAFC, this is something that is a wonderful idea for practices both small and large. This is not a patient board of directors, it's an advisory council so that when you have operational changes like self-scheduling, or maybe you're going to make a change to your telephones or your patient portal, that it is an easy way to get feedback. A group of patients and or family of patients, guardians, for example, or caregivers that you can ask some questions to about your practice and glean some feedback before you introduce it to all of your patients. And it's a wonderful marketing mechanisms too, because those patients really see you as reaching out to the community to get feedback about ideas to operate the practice. So in terms of our planning stage, we also want to make sure that we really think about the next section, which is our DSA, our do, and then of course we want to make sure we study as well as act. And so our doing is, let's go ahead and put out our self-scheduling platform and of course test the results. We want to make sure we analyze, is this what we were going for? What do we learn? Maybe we were too aggressive with the number of appointments or the type of appointments, and we need to step back and go back to the planning stage. I'm working with a practice right now that's doing that. They actually turned their platform off. It wasn't ideal, but it wasn't working for them. And they're being smart to make sure it's refined and ready to go prime time. So they're taking a little bit of a step back and then repeating the PDSA cycle. And then, of course, act, implement the best solution, and make sure that's the new standard that's documented and implemented as well. So the PDSA gives you a wonderful framework for any sort of initiative, including self-scheduling. But there's always going to be refinements. So how can we create a seamless patient experience? I think that always needs to be in the back of our minds so that we're figuring out from both new patients' perspectives as well as existing or established patients' perspectives. What does this mean? How is this self-scheduling platform really an opportunity for us to have that seamless experience? And then what about patients who try it, but they can't get the appointment or they don't want the appointment that you're offering through your self-scheduling platform? So this refinement stage is super duper important, and it may be that you want to create or have or hold those meetings that we talked about before 6 months after you launch your self-scheduling platform to really look at this. Have we achieved that seamless patient experience for all of our patients? What feedback are we getting either directly from our patient family advisory counselor or, as I like to call it, our patient murmur log, so that when patients kind of drop you a, hey, this didn't quite work for me, it's not really a formal patient satisfaction survey like a sort of CG CAPS type of thing, but it's just a murmur. But a murmur is important for us to document and keep in our murmur log. So pulling that out and seeing if we've gotten any comments with regard to our self-scheduling platform, I think is a great opportunity for us in this refinement stage. And of course, we want to make sure data drives our decision making. So hopefully you have some sort of executive dashboard for your practice today. It might include things like collections and days and receivables outstanding, and of course, expenses or overhead. But we also want to make sure our KPIs incorporate our self-scheduling. So let's break it down and start looking at data. For example, how many new patients have scheduled on our self-scheduling platform? And what about established patients? And then, and of course, this is totally up to y'all, but I think there's really two key KPIs with self-scheduling that drive a lot of the value proposition, and those are payer mix, first of all. So we do see from experience with practices that offer self-scheduling platforms that the patients who use them are generally younger. Remember, we started off with our generations, and they also have a high commercial patient population in terms of payer mix. And one of the other big values, of course, with regard to self-scheduling is a higher arrival rate. And that's an inverse of the no-show rate. So you can look at it either way. I like to look at it as a sort of positive glass half full instead of a glass half empty by looking at an arrival rate instead of a non-arrival rate. But it's totally up to you. Arrival rate, of course, we ideally are going to see that increase, and I certainly have in practices with which I've worked who have launched self-scheduling. This again has been big win-win, payer mix as well as arrival rate. payer mix being heavily commercial, and then our arrival rate being higher with patients who are the drivers of when and how they are self-scheduling. This is really an exciting opportunity. And, it's interesting because I also think this is an opportunity in our PDSA cycle or our refinement phase to think about scheduling in general. We saw that kind of crazy chart. And when we think about the scheduling process in general in medical practices, it really is kind of a game of Tetris. And frankly, we've actually created a lot of barriers to that Tetris game along the way. The pieces just simply don't fit. It's not uncommon for me to work with practices that have hundreds, if not 1,000 different types of appointment types. So all of those blocks, how can patients' pieces, their Tetris pieces, fit in? I would argue that sometimes they can't, if not most time. And we spend a lot of staff trying to make the Tetris game work. But self-scheduling asks us to step back and say, hey, we've got to automate this process. If we are automating Tetris, you and I both know it's got to be a very simple game of Tetris to make it work. So how can we take down some of those barriers? The barriers, for example, I was working with a practice just recently where all of its patients had to have quote unquote referrals. And I'm using air quotes when I talk about that because when I asked them, what exactly is a referral? What does that mean? They said, oh, Elizabeth, it's the fax cover sheet with our referral on it, right? Because they actually have practices that refer to them. They're required to send in this certain form. And then, of course, the patient's record. And I said, is that actually required by some federal or state law or insurance company? And they're like, no, 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 no. It's our referral. So we have to step back and think about, well, is that actually required? Well, the answer, of course, is no. And then they take the medical records and they have a nurse who types up a sort of case report about every patient based on their records. And then that case report is reviewed by the doctor. And then if the doctor says yes, which, by the way, 99% of the time he does, the patient is then called back to see whether or not he or she wants to schedule the appointment. The game of Tetris is significant at this practice, and when you actually look at the numbers, only 70% of those patients who actually had their quote-unquote referrals faxed even get the phone call to get the appointment schedule, and that call goes through. Indeed, 30% of those patients have either moved on or there's no way to communicate with them. And think about how much money we've spent putting all this paperwork through and all these case reports typed up and the time the doctor has spent, and I could go on and on. Has the game of Tetris become so complicated at your practice that it's become a barrier? This is a great opportunity to really think about simplification, to go down perhaps to just 3 or 4 standard appointment types. Now, you can have lots of information about the reason for the visit. I'm not suggesting that. But if your slots have become the reason for the visit, left arm pain with toe pain as well, like if that is your slot, your self-scheduling is going to really be difficult in terms of making it successful. So down to 3 or 4 standard types may be just the ticket for you to begin that game of Tetris that really can set up your self-scheduling platform to be successful. And remember that it's not just the function of self-scheduling, it's how your patients actually reach your self-scheduling platform. We do know that the most important thing of all is security. We've got to make sure that our self-scheduling platform is secure. We need to 100% make sure that our patients can find us when they go searching on Google, particularly if we are reaching out in terms of a game plan associated with our self-scheduling platform for new patients. So search engine optimization is vital. We do want our patients' digital experience in 2019 and moving into 2020 to be absolutely critical. In fact, we want to think as much about digital experience as we do customer experience. So your DX strategy or digital experience is critical, and indeed self-scheduling, I think, should actually be really a pillar of that experience strategy. Look at this, 2 seconds is the threshold for e-commerce website accessibility. What's yours? Because at Google, they aim for just under half a second. This is incredible, but even if we don't like it, this is what our patients are beginning to expect. Now, indeed, some of our opportunity simply has to do with some very basic appointment scheduling ideas. Like, for example, as we're moving into self-scheduling, why don't we think about the schedule's impact on our day? The new patient at the top of the morning or the top of the afternoon clinic, i.e. the 8 o'clock slot if you start at 8 or the 1 p.m. slot in the afternoon. If we schedule a new patient there, that is a patient who is indeed more likely to no-show, more likely to be late because they've never been at your practice, and 100% of the time more likely to take additional time through the front office. Why? Because we simply have more work to do when it comes to assignment of benefits and all the other paperwork that we have to do for new patients instead of existing patients at our front office. And please also recognize that if we have slots that are at the top of the hour and the top of the half hour, for example, we go 8, 8:30, 9, 9:30, 10, 10:30, and we have multiple physicians. Y'all, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Why do we all have to schedule for a 9 a.m. or a 10 a.m. slot? We really don't have to. You're actually able to give patients appointments at 10:10 or 10:15 or 10:20, and life's going to be okay. I sort of joke about that because for some reason we can think that we have 5 doctors who are seeing patients in our practice, and we schedule 5 1 p.m. appointments, and we have 1 patient service representative staffing the front office. And somehow tomorrow we think there won't be a line there. No, there'll be a line there tomorrow as well. So 5, 1, and 5, that is 5 physicians, 1 receptionist, and 5 patients all at the same time. It's simply a recipe for disaster, or at least a long waiting line. So when we think about a practice with multiple physicians, it's a great idea to stagger start times as well as times throughout the day. So these tiny refinement opportunities are a great thing to do. Instead of just making this self-scheduling initiative a scheduling initiative, make it a really awesome opportunity to engage with our operations, to engage with our medical assistants and our nurses and our front office staff, and really make self-scheduling a pathway for success from a patient flow perspective too. This is a great time to be thinking about that as well. Now, of course, we want to make sure that the self-scheduling initiative that we have offers a wonderful return on investment. Now, I've already mentioned arrival rate and payer mix, but let me just dwell on these categories for just a few minutes. Now, you can see we've got categories like arrival rate, utilization or fill rate, payer mix, and then, of course, other. Now, I'm not suggesting that these are the be-all, end-all. This is just indeed getting you started. You may have other data points you want to measure as you move into your initiative, but let's measure them today, pre-implementation, because what we want to be able to do is 4, 5, 6 months from now, look back and say, was this successful or was it not? And if we forget to have measured these things, boy and howdy, that's either going to create a lot of work or it's going to leave us in a situation where we are unable to convince ourselves that this indeed was a successful initiative. So our arrival rate, we ideally want to see those no-shows and cancellations drop. And again, I can say with confidence, as I've worked with practices that have initiated self-scheduling, that's indeed what they are seeing. Our non-arrival rates are going down and our arrival rates are going up. And I think it's just intuitive. We're giving our patients the opportunity to go ahead and schedule their own appointments. They've got their calendars out instead of just listening to us feed them times and dates and saying, yes, yes, okay, that sounds good. Our arrival rates, I think you'll find, are going to go up. But let's make sure we measure that. Now, we also want to determine our utilization or fill rate. Now, this is an interesting one because when you look at your appointment schedule for tomorrow, I bet it looks like every single slot is completely filled, maybe even for next week as well. But utilization or fill rate asks us to actually look backwards, look at yesterday, kind of think of it like seats on a plane, right? Delta might actually fill up all of the seats on the plane, but once that flight actually takes off, how many passengers are indeed in their seats? Things happen. As we saw from the chart a few minutes ago, our providers might bump some patients, our patients might bump us, either calling us or telling us in advance, or indeed not showing up at all. So ideally, we want to use our self-service, our self-scheduling platform to make sure that we are filling up as many of those seats as possible with arrived patients. So ideally, that utilization rate, we're going to see that bump up as we move into self-scheduling. Again, much with the same rationale that we discussed before, because now that we've put our patients in the driver's seat, they're more likely to come and stick in their seats. And then last but not least, thinking about payer mix. Now you could actually replace this category with commercial payer mix or percent of patients who are commercial. This is totally up to you. But what we want to do is to see if our self-scheduling initiative enables us to move into a more favorable category of payers that pay us a higher rate in terms of the encounters that we actually see, the encounters that we actually perform. Now, it might not just be a quote unquote higher rate. Maybe we have an at-risk contract, or we're working with an ACO, or we have a direct contract with an employer that we really want to give this as a service offering. And so it may not necessarily be dollars, right? We're getting more money per patient encounter, but we're really enabling us to service a certain patient population that we've reached out with this self-scheduling platform as an enhancement in terms of the contract that we're offering. In that case, we'd want to try to measure how much volume we're getting from that patient population. So you can see where I'm going with this. The categories that I put here, arrival rate, utilization rate, and payer mix, just some examples for you to really start thinking about why self-scheduling is important for your practice. Now, what I'm going to do is to turn it over to Sean, who's going to tell us a little bit more about MedFusion and their self-scheduling platform.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Very insightful as always. You know, you're exactly right. So many clients we speak with would agree that scheduling is like a game of Tetris. Everyone wants to optimize their daily schedule, but sometimes fail to take the necessary steps or use the right tools to make this happen. Some even ask, why is self-scheduling important to our practice? If you think about it, consumers are already used to self-scheduling. I scheduled an airline flight last week, an Uber ride last weekend, and I need to book a barber's appointment. So patients have the same expectations of their healthcare provider. This year, we're on track to schedule about 1 billion self-scheduled appointments in healthcare in the US. And out of the healthcare systems in the US, over 66% of them are ready to embrace this digital technology. The great thing about patient self-scheduling is that the practice is completely in charge of what the appointments the patients can self-schedule. Typically, we recommend that you offer the basic routine appointments. We've got a pediatric practices specifically using it for flu clinics, as well as school physicals, things like that, orthopedic and OB/GYN for simple follow-up appointments. But if you think about the average appointment, when they're actually calling in, it could be anywhere from 2 to 15 minutes, depending on the complexity of the appointment. But on average, we're seeing about 8 minutes per call. So if you can just imagine giving those basic routine appointment types to the patient to self-schedule, this helps reduce the overall call volume coming into the practice. As you can see, primary care appointments have risen about 5.4% since the ACA passage in 2009. So in helping with that, about 77% of patients, when they're actively looking for a new practice to join, they're specifically looking for online scheduling. Having that capability to change or cancel appointments is very important to them, because about 63% of those calls coming in are actually being transferred, which will only frustrate the patient. These are just only a few of the data points I wanted to cover. Going on to the next slide, let's talk about automating the patient experience with patient self-scheduling. The great thing about our solution is that it can help you reduce the overall cost along with reducing the number of incoming calls. We've seen some practice call volume drop upwards of 15 to 30%. With this, you're going to be able to reallocate staff to do other things around the clinic. Patients will also have the capability to schedule through any type of device, whether it be a tablet or a smartphone or a computer, when it's convenient for them. New patients seeking providers that offer self-scheduling, that's a huge differentiator and a great way to capture new patients 24/7, 365 days a year. Also, it's a great way to help maximize your schedule openings. Our implementation team will work with you to customize what appointments you're going to offer and the availability that the patients will have, whether it's scheduled the same day or a couple days out. Ultimately, with patient self-scheduling, it's really putting the patients to work. Again, extending the hours of the practice, letting the patient schedule when and how it's convenient for them. It's also enabling you to collect information prior to the patient visit. Overall, it's going to delight and retain your patients and reduce hold times. As we know, the front desk team can be frustrated hopping from call to call, especially on those busy Mondays, but it's also frustrating for the patients. So we're going to give the scheduling team more time to work with those more complicated calls and give the patients the capability to schedule very simple routines and basic appointment types. On this next slide, I want to give you a sense of the look and feel of the scheduling interface. Our design team focuses on keeping the interface intuitive with a clean look. During implementation, you'll have the ability to brand the solution to your practice with English and Spanish capability. On the left side, you'll see the patient can set their own search criteria. And on the right, they can track where they are in the scheduling process. And of course, we have Google Maps integrated so you can identify the location you want to visit. Not only is the interface customizable, but the backend setup is highly configurable to the provider's complex work schedules and unique workflows. On this next slide, this is one of our reference customers, KSF Orthopedic. They've been on the patient self-scheduling solution for some time. Prior to them starting with our solution, they had a no-show rate of about 12%. Shortly after implementing the solution, their no-show rate dropped 8 points down to 4%. They've also seen a call reduction of about 30% of incoming calls. This is a great success story, and if you're interested, I can send you the digital copy of their results. That's it for the slides I have to share today. Before we go to Q&A portion, we'd love to have a conversation with you and share an online demo with your team. So please email us at letstalk@medfusion.com, or if you'd rather, give us a call at 919-882-2831. Let's go to Q&A. Terry?
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Elizabeth. That's great information. So I have a couple questions that came in. How do you suggest getting our providers and staff on board with self-scheduling? I think that would be directed towards Elizabeth.
Thanks so much, Terry. That is a great question. And certainly we went over some of those ideas, but I do want to reiterate making sure that we get our team engaged from the very get-go. So what that means is instead of just saying, okay, guys, next Monday we're launching this, we want to actually have a staff meeting where we share with our team self-scheduling. This something we've been thinking about. What do y'all think? And maybe even engaging with some questions about what are the pros and cons? What do you think our patients will do? What types of offerings we would? And you know, it's really interesting because I think there's some lessons to be learned from having the implementation of portals a few years back. Of course, because of meaningful use, etc., many practices got portals in the last 5 years. And sometimes I don't think we launched them very successfully. And I say that because it was kind of an IT thing, and our patients were just told about it because our staff was just told about it as well. This is what we're going to do. Well, let's take the opportunity to really engage our team from the very get-go, our staff, our providers, our physicians, by asking them about their input before we launch the process. And I think at the end of the day, our self-scheduling is going to be much more successful if we can have our team engage in the framework of the launch. Terry?
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Couple questions look maybe specifically to MedFusion. So Sean, looks like what is your typical contract length was a question, and maybe we can take that one offline.
Yeah, I mean, it's variable, obviously, like most contracts, but yeah, absolutely. We'd love to discuss that further with the client who's asking, for sure.
Absolutely. So we will get in touch with you regarding that specifically. And then what participation level do you see from patients with the patient self-scheduling solution?
Oh, we're seeing most of the younger, if you separate it generationally, we're looking at a lot of the younger folks who are actually absolutely having to do it or wanting to do it. And that kind of falls off as you get to the baby boomers. But participation for most of our clients it's a must-have. Just probably making up 70 to 80% of their scheduling.
And I'd like to ring in on this one too. Terry, I completely concur with Sean, and actually would even say that the biggest downside or the biggest problem is that there are not enough slots available. In other words, we are the issue, not the patients. We have more patients who are clamoring, who are demanding, than there are even slots that we put out there on our platform to be utilized via self-scheduling. And so it's really been interesting. Within weeks, I often see practices that are like, oh, we were just putting out, 2, 3, 4, 5 slots a day. Now we've got to make sure we recognize that, wow, those are filling almost instantly. And we've got to think about maybe putting out 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 more every single day. And so the bigger issue is the demand is so high for this that it becomes a game changer internally as we really think about ourselves as the barriers, not the patients.
Yeah, one thing to add on to that, Elizabeth, I think if you break it down per appointment type, the simple appointments make up the majority for a lot of our clients, whether it's rescheduling or a new appointment. And the mix that we work with on our clients is hugely variable. So some just want the simple appointments and some want all appointments online.
Excellent. Thank you both. So another question came in. What percentage of total appointments do we see scheduled? I think that kind of goes along with what you were just talking about, Elizabeth.
Yes, absolutely. And I would say it is near 100% for those that are actually offered. And so it really depends on the practice. If you see 100 patient encounters a day, you're probably scheduling, 110, 120 for that day. And so if you are putting out, 40, as Sean said, it's very common for, established patients, and I'll use the term the more simple appointment types. I generally find that those are all going to be taken if you offer them via self-scheduling. So really the percentage depends on what's the denominator. And if we're talking about the denominator of those that are offered online, that's generally going to run pretty close to 100%. Sean, do you find that to be your experience as well?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're offering, they're going to take the appointment. If you look at overall scheduling, so if you have 100 people wanting to schedule, but you only set up a certain appointment type to be scheduled, you will find that 70% of all 80% of all scheduling will be online. But if you look at just online, that'll be 100% or very close to it. Terry?
Okay. Someone's asking, what's the best strategy for scheduling for specialties like neurology, where there are many subspecialties?
I can take that. I really think that there's a couple of opportunities. Neurology might not be the best practice to have new patients self-scheduling, just as our caller has identified. It can be in a particularly complex subspecialty practice. However, once a neurology patient is established, neurology is a fairly unique specialty in that there's not typically a graduation. In other words, oftentimes those patients are followed through their lifetime. And so the patient becomes fairly familiar with the practice. And so this is a great opportunity once the patient is established. If you see the patient, once per year, or depending on the patient type, maybe it's once per quarter, once every 6 months, is to sit down quite often with the patient or his or her caregiver. And of course, that's another almost unique aspect about neurology, is quite often there's a very, very high level of involvement from caregivers. And I will tell you, this can really be an amazing opportunity in terms of a value add for those caregivers who may have, like, they're caring for someone, they're at work, they're trying to figure this out. And so being able to schedule online, wow, for their, parents or spouses neurology appointment, this can truly be a gift that you give them. So I do think each specialty has its own navigation to take, but there are absolutely those just pearls, those gems, when we think about every single specialty where you can be giving an incredible benefit to your patients. And for neurology, I think it's that almost a lifelong aspect of those established patients coming back again, so engaging with those patients and really thinking about this as an incredible value for caregivers who are taking care of patients for neurology practices. Oh, this would be a huge benefit. I know it would be in my case, as I'm a caregiver for a patient of a neurology practice. Sean, do you have anything to add about that?
No, you nailed it. Very good.
Excellent. Okay, another question came in. How do we get the word out to our patients?
I can take this, and then Sean, I'd certainly love your perspective as well. But it's amazing to me that I see practices who don't even talk about this to their patients. They just, they're like, okay, we're just going to quietly, we'll just put it up on our website, and boom, the next day they get up and at 8 o'clock, they've already had 5 patients who scheduled. I mean, patients are looking for this. They're going to our websites, they're looking on our portals, and they're saying, what else can I do online? I'm super busy between 8 and 5. I may not have time to call y'all during lunch, if you even answer your phones. And so they're actually pinging, going on the website after hours, and they're going to grab this opportunity if they see it. So in some ways, I'm not even sure you have to get a big word out, Terry. However, this is a great thing, just like we did with our portals, and maybe are continuing to do this. We are, able to take communication with our physicians. And now it's like, oh my gosh, did you know you can schedule online with our doctors? So like, make this a big win-win. Have it in your maybe little postcards that you have with like a QR symbol. You can get your patients right into your self-scheduling platform when they come into your practice. Maybe even you could hand them a tablet and you could have that even queued up, and they can kind of test it out by scheduling their own follow-up appointments, like right there, right at your practice. And I like to call the checkout person the concierge. Your concierge staff could even help your patients, but it could be like kind of like a test, and it would be a win-win if they scheduled their follow-up or their post-op appointments right in front of you using your self-scheduling platform. So like, lots of fun ideas. You could even have a little contest with your staff about, who told the most patients about the self-scheduling platform, because you really want to try to get the word out, especially if you've put a lot of slots available on that platform. So lots of fun ideas, but I got to tell you, I think your patients are craving this, and I think once you launch it, you're going to get some action. Sean, do you feel the same way?
Yeah, those are really great ideas. All in office signage you can do, buttons, anything that you can do, put it on your card. But one thing I think that's really worked is any digital communications you have with your patients, put it in your tagline. Make sure that they're aware everything that they get. Make sure that there's a link back to that site, whether it's on your website or let them know it's in the portal. Terry?
Great idea.
And I just want to make sure I'm getting to everybody's questions here, and this is a little bit repetitive, but someone's asked what percentage of total encounters per day are scheduled online versus over the phone. Do we have some stats on that?
Well, it's certainly the online is growing as customers are taking this product. We see of overall scheduling, we're seeing about 70–80% of people doing overall scheduling. There's a lot that they don't want to schedule on their online just because it's more complex. So they want those patients, whether it's a new patient or whether it's a patient that has more complex needs for their schedule, those will automatically not be pushed in. By appointment type is how we define that. So those will be pushed and they won't be allowed to do online. So we're seeing about 70–80% of overall, but like we had talked about before, 100%, almost 100% of online scheduling is taken up. Do you agree?
I certainly would agree with that. Again, I think it's where you set the denominator, and a practice needs to make its decision about what that denominator is. What are those offerings? But generally, when you look at that denominator from the online offerings, that's going to be at or close to 100%, at least in my experience.
Yeah, I think that's what sets us apart is when we go through the setup, when we implement a client, we go through the setup of appointment type, provider level, and all the resources. So we configure it in a way that makes sense to the customer. And we have pre-planning with them where we really want to define what they want to do with scheduling. And I think that makes a huge difference as they go down the road. And to make sure, one, it's successful, and two, they're getting the right clients to schedule online. Terry?
Excellent. Okay, so I guess along the same lines, how do you get the providers and staff on board with self-scheduling? So we know the patients want it and they're using it, but how do we get the providers to use it?
Oh, it's so easy. Just because it takes this burdensome effort out of their hands of taking calls. If you can imagine, and I think I quoted like the average call is 8 minutes. If you can imagine taking 30 calls of 8-minute calls a day. That's a huge time waster that doesn't need to happen. There's no change management that you really have to do. We do really in-depth training of how it looks in their PM system, but it's not a hard push by any means. Elizabeth, do you have anything to add?
No, I would definitely concur. I think this is, I don't want to say an easy lift in terms of really moving it forward in terms of staff and provider engagement. But I do think that to really make it successful, just taking 1 or 2 staff and provider meetings before you get started to ask some of the questions that we talked about a few slides ago, and to really engage the team from the get-go in terms of the benefits, the drawbacks, particularly as each one of our audience members is representing different specialties, different practices, different games of Tetris. Having their perspective from the beginning, I think will really make all the difference in the world in terms of, 2 or 3 months down the line when people really say, like, was this successful or not? If they were engaged from the get-go, I bet you're going to have more cries of yes, 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 than you would if you just launched it kind of from a back room. Terry?
Great answers, thanks. I think, let's see, we have a couple more, probably more specific to MedFusion. Can the patient self-scheduling home screen be branded with our logo?
Certainly. That's a part of the interface customization that I talked about. You'll be able to choose the site color that fits within your scheme from your website, along with adding your logo. If you want to add provider photos, you can do that as well. And this provides for a more seamless user experience. Terry?
Excellent. Does the patient self-scheduling solution integrate with my practice management system?
Yeah, so today we have 4 integrations: Centricity, NextGen, Greenway, and Athena, but we're looking for more to come in the next year. Terry?
And is the patient self-scheduling access point within the portal?
Yes, so you can access it through MedFusion's portal, and or through the provider's website. You can have 2 avenues to access the scheduling app. Terry?
And I think that's just about it. Yeah, I think we've answered all the questions. Very engaged audience, which is always great. And thank you, Elizabeth, for all your expertise, and Sean. And as a reminder to the folks on the line, I will be sending this recording out next week, so look for that in your inbox from me. And I appreciate everybody's time today. In the last screen here, you'll see the contact information for Elizabeth and for Sean. Feel free to reach out if you have any additional specific questions. Thank you for everybody's time today.